Welcome to another Hayley-Roxanna crafts video on cross stitching. In this video I am going to show you how to unpick your cross stitching. Sometimes this is referred to as frogging, or people will say that they've had a visit from the frog. And the term frogging is used because you are ripping it out, and rip it sounds a bit like ribbit, the sound a frog makes. Now, unpicking or frogging your cross stitch is something you probably want to avoid having to do. But mistakes can happen. You can accidentally stitch with the wrong coloured thread, or you can just miscount slightly. It happens. And sometimes these mistakes aren't noticeable, or they can be hidden with just a slight adjustment to the design. And you can leave them in. And some people say that that's just personalising your cross stitch, which is fine if you're happy with that. However, I'm the sort of person, I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and if I make a mistake, I like to undo it and put it right. And there are occasions where you can make mistakes that are just too big and too noticeable to hide. So I'm going to share with you some tips for how I unpick my cross stitching when it is necessary. So one method that some people will use to remove or unpick stitches is to use a seam ripper like this. You just take the cover off and then you just slip this end under your stitches and literally just rip them and then pull out the bits of thread. This is a method that I never use, and I would strongly advise other people against using it. There's two reasons for this. Firstly, and this is probably the main reason I'd advise against it, is that it would be so easy to accidentally damage or rip the fabric, which is something you really don't want to do. We all know it's not cheap, so you don't want to go wasting it by ripping it. But secondly, it's also a bit of a waste of thread because you can't reuse the pieces that you take out. So I'm actually going to share other methods that I do use, which with a bit of care, you can actually manage to save most of the thread to reuse again at a later date. For me, the best way of removing stitches is to actually just use your needle. And if you only need to unpick the last couple of stitches you've done, you may even be able to remove the stitches without having to unthread the needle just by stitching in reverse. So just going back down through the holes you've come through, pull that thread through like so, just to undo them. Okay, which, like I said, is fine if you've only got a couple of stitches to undo. But if you find you've got a lot of stitches to undo, or even if you've got an area that you need to undo where there's lots of stitches in the surrounding area as well, it can be easier to just unthread your needle and then just carefully use that needle to lift out the stitches like so. You do have to be careful that you are only catching the threads you want to pull back through. So when you're doing the tops of crosses, just make sure that you are only catching the top bits like so, and then just very gently pull your thread through. This can damage the thread slightly as you're doing this, but usually you can save a fair amount of it to reuse again if you are just careful that you are only pulling what needs to come through. You do need to go quite slowly and carefully doing this, because again, that does just help with limiting the damage that can be done to the thread and your fabric even. And if you find some of the holes have opened up as you're doing this, you can just give them a gentle rub and they will close again. It also helps if you can try and remember what order you stitched in, because obviously you don't really want to be pulling at stitches up here when it's actually stitches lower down that you need to undo. Because again, this can lead to damage to the thread and to your fabric. It's also a good reason why it does help if you actually stitch in a logical order, because then it makes it easier to remember where you stitch so that you can undo it in the reverse order to what you stitched it in the first place. And if you need to unpick multiple colours, it's best to start with the last colour that you actually stitch with. So say I've done this pink and then I've got another section of like blue that I've done after it, and then realise they're both in the wrong place. I would unpick the blue first and then unpick the pink, just in case there's any areas where the pink thread is under the blue at the back. So yeah, and it's also another reason why it is easier if the back is neat, or at least as neat as possible, because it does help you with your unpicking, as you won't have too many threads sort of tangled together at the back. Sometimes when you're cross stitching, you may not notice a mistake immediately. You may spot it after you've done a bit more work, and sometimes this can be a lot more work, or sometimes it might just be a little bit more of the project. But you may have even fastened off threads where the mistake is. So when I was stitching this Disney Pixar Sampler and I was doing the Wally, I made a mistake in my border. I'd actually stitched this row one square over to the left from where it should be. And I didn't actually realise that until I'd started completing Wally, and I was actually completing this section here and found it wasn't sitting on the right part of the border. So I had to go back to the border and undo it. Now, because I had already fastened off, it meant I had to find where I'd fastened off thread nearest to where I'd made the mistake. Now, if you're somebody who only slips your thread under a few stitches to fasten off, it's quite easy because you can just find where you did that, and it's one of the reasons why if your back's neat, it does make it easier to spot where you did that, and you can just pull the thread back through and then start undoing from that point. I actually knot my threads as well as pull them through, but I usually find I can undo the knots quite easily. But if you've knotted your thread and you can't get it undone easily, you may need to just use a pair of scissors to snip it, and I would advise using embroidery scissors. These are the pair that I use when I'm stitching. But if you're snipping thread, you may even want something with a finer point, so maybe something more like these ones, just for you to carefully snip that knot off, taking care that you don't cut other threads. You definitely don't want to cut your fabric, because that's a very, very difficult mistake to rectify. And then you can start unpicking from there. But sometimes the mistake might be a long way away from where you have fastened off your thread. So you may end up having to undo an awful lot of work. And you might not want to do that, and it can actually be easier. And this is what I did when I was undoing my border here. I actually just snipped one of the threads. I literally took my scissors and just slipped them under the top of one of the stitches, right by the mistake. Snipped the thread, and then I just undid my work back a few stitches in each direction until I'd got enough to be able to fasten off the thread again. So I removed the mistake, and yes, it meant I did remove a few other stitches that weren't in the wrong place as well. But it did make it easier to rectify the mistake just from how I'd stitched in the first place. So once I'd then undone what I needed to and fastened off, I just rethreaded in the same colour and put the rest back into place in the right place. I did also have to undo all of this, but this was where I'd finished stitching, so that was quite easy because I just undid at the end and started coming back. It was just when I got to this area, I'd actually stitched these stitches when I'd started over on this side, so I would have had to have undone all of this bit as well just to undo those 3 stitches, which is why it was quicker just to snip there and just undo a few back just to get rid of those and put it right. So in an ideal world, we wouldn't make mistakes when we're cross stitching, But we don't live in an ideal world. Nobody's perfect. And sometimes, no matter how much you have counted and recounted to ensure that you are in the right place or you've done the right number of stitches, we can still make a mistake. We can still be out a little bit. There's times where you can just pick up a wrong coloured thread and you've done a fair few stitches with it before you've even realised you're actually using the wrong colour and it doesn't quite look right. Hopefully, when we do make a mistake that we know needs unpicking and there is no way it can be disguised, or we're just not happy with disguising it, that we realise quite quickly, so that the unpicking isn't too painful to do. And I hope that the tips that I've shared in this video will help when that unpicking is necessary, because we all know it's going to happen at some point when we're cross stitching. Any items I have used in this video I have put links to in the description. If you've got any questions, please pop them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them for you. Thank you for watching and I'll see you next time. Bye!